Hey, hello, comrades, and welcome back to my YouTube show. Привет, товарищи, и добро пожаловать на мой YouTube show. And today I am going to talk about Nikita Khrushchev's 1953 plan, also known as the Virgin Land Campaign in 1953. So I'm going to talk about, that's going to be the subject of this video today. And so now I'm going to go into little details about the 1953 Virgin Land Campaign or program. So, and that was basically a plan to create more Soviet factories in the southern republics like Kazakhstan, Siberia, and the Caucasus, which were in the USSR at the time. And so during that period, it was when the Soviets started to put this create these factories so they could produce enough food, so they could create enough food so the people could eat and stuff. And so I'm going to talk about more details about it. And so in September of 1953, there was a meeting in the Central Committee, which were basically like this guys who were responsible for electing the leader or the general secretary, general secretar se kako países. And so they were the guys who elected them. And so there was the Soviet premier, Yuri Malenkov. He was the premier of the Soviet Russia at the time, with Nikita Khrushchev, who was the first secretary of the party, who took over after the death of Comrade Stalin on March 5th, 1953. And so following his death, Malenkov and Khrushchev took power as the new leaders of USSR, while Khrushchev took over as the general secretary, the first secretary, while Malenkov took over as the premier, or the prime minister of the Soviet Union. And so during the meeting in the Central Committee, Malenkov came up with a plan basically to solve the problem in the agriculture. In the agriculture in the USSR, because there was a crisis an agricultural crisis in the USSR, because these factories were not producing enough food, were not producing a lot of food during that time. And so Malenkov wanted to introduce a reform. Then came Khrushchev. Khrushchev then made a reform. His reform was he wanted to create more factories, so they could create, and more peasants could work in the factories, and so they could produce enough food and stuff. And so that was Khrushchev's reform in the Soviet Russia during that time. And so it was 1954, in June 1954. I think he and a bunch of other government officials visited the Virgin Land, which is in the Kazakhstan. That was where they were producing food, basically. And the land increased because there were more factories in the Kazakhstan, Siberia, and this Caucasus. And so they made more factories and stuff like that in the Kazakh Soviet Republic, and the Siberia, and the Caucasus. And so that was basically it. That's what they did during that time there. And so the land increased by 50% during that time, which was known as the Virgin Land Campaign that Khrushchev launched in 1953. And so that lasted, I think it was all the way till the early 60s, the time when Khrushchev was removed from power as leader. And then there was a lot of food during that time. The Soviet factories started to produce a lot of food, like grain and bread, which in Russian is known as хлеб, and they started to produce other products in the factories during that period. And also around the same time, that was also when this construction project, because there were poor living conditions in the USSR during the Khrushchev rule. Because if you remember, by the end of World War II, a lot of cities in the Soviet Union were destroyed because of the Germans attacked so many towns in the U.S. cities in the USSR, like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and a bunch of other cities were destroyed, and towns were destroyed too, and towns were destroyed as well. And so Stalin started a program called the Molotov Plan, which was to reconstruct the cities that were destroyed by the Nazis during World War II. And so then it was by the late 50s, and then Khrushchev started another project which was called uh, the Khrushchevsky project, or Khrushchev's project, which was basically to create new apartment buildings because the apartment buildings were destroyed during the war. And so Khrushchev came up with that plan. And it was over 60 million apartment buildings were built in the USSR under the rule of Nikita Khrushchev. And so also during that time, it was when this farmers because the factories started to decrease, because the workers were starting to it started to decrease because the workers were working in the factories, and they didn't have an apartment building, and so it decreased during that period. And so they mostly worked in this, and then the jobs in the country, in the Soviet factories throughout the Kazakh and Siberia and Caucasus decreased because workers started started getting apartment buildings, and so the factory jobs started to decrease during that period in the 50s, and that was a crisis during the late 50s. So, yep, that was Nikita Khrushchev's 1953 plan. That was known as the Virgin Land Campaign, which was to create more factories in the Soviet Kazakhstan, Siberia, and the Caucasus. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. До свидания, пока, goodbye.